You're listening to a Brother Asks and Building Better Builders video education series production.
Welcome to the Craftsman Online podcast, the only 5-star rated Masonic podcast endorsed by the Grand Lodge of New York. Any opinions, thoughts, or viewpoints shared during this program are that of the individual and do not reflect the official position of any Grand Lodge, appendant, or concordant body from which that member may hail. I'm your host, Brother Michael Arce, co-founder of CraftsmenOnline.com, and you've joined us for a discussion on Murder and Treason Accepted. During the obligation of the Master Mason degree, a brother finds himself repeating the words murder and treason accepted. But does this mean that Freemasons are bound to protect each other above the law? It's the question we're going to be posing to Brother John Nagy, who joins us once again on the exploration of the origins of these words and the deeper meanings on the bind they create in the brothers in our craft. Welcome back to the Craftsman Online podcast, Brother John.
Thanks again for having me back, Brother Michael. It's an honor and a privilege.
Oh, it's always a pleasure when you're here. I think the key thing for this episode is what I hear a lot in the third degree, especially during that obligation part, is the pronunciation of the words. Accepted, not accepted. How key is that understanding? Murder and treason accepted, not accepted.
Well, the two words definitely don't have the same meaning. Accepted means, excluding, and accepted means embracing. So it's like exclusion or embracing. Big difference when you're talking about murder and treason.
Right. And we laugh, but it's one of those things like during the ritual and even afterwards, if hearing that, if it's spoken quickly, it sounds like, well, murder and treason accepted. They're free and accepted, or ancient free and accepted Masons. Is that what that phrase means? I think it could be one of the biggest problems that falls across all Masonic jurisdictions.
And this is one of the greatest difficulties I have when men are going through the first, second, and third degree, and they don't understand what's being said to them and what they're obligating themselves to. Did they actually think the word accepted and say, yeah, I can embrace that? Yeah, murder and treason, bring it on. Or are they actually hearing, well, murder and treason excluded, which means basically I'm committing to this, keeping secrets of a brother, except for when it comes to murder and treason.
Right.
And, in all honesty, I don't think any sane person would, or shall I say ethical and moral person, would take on that obligation and not hesitate saying, hey, what exactly was that last word? Can you spell it out for me?
Well, I think it also lends to one of the myths that's floating out there in the many about Freemasons and Masonry in particular, is you'll often hear people say, oh, well, they take oaths and they promise not to testify against each other in a court of law. And I could see where if that line is mispronounced, it does sound like, okay, we follow all laws unless it comes down to this one thing. So let's break that line down into the two parts that exist here. First, we're going to examine the keyword murder and the time period that these degrees were written, mainly in the mid 1920s, or sorry, 1720s. That's a big difference. And most will say like the Master Mason's degree was pretty well established by the mid 1730s. How relevant was that term murder, especially in committing the crime of murder during that time period?
Well, in any time period, that's a serious offense. And when you have somebody promising to keep the secrets of a brother Mason, that is a biggie. Would be as relevant then as it is today. So was it the time period or the relevance? I think it's the relevance. And quite honestly, when you're talking about murder and treason, those are serious things to keep in your chest when you know very much that the brother who either is attempting to commit it or has committed it, you're now involved. And you can't go against what it is that you've obligated yourself to do, and that is to make sure that you stay true to your morals, your ethics, your religion, and of course, the law, your civic duty. And so when you obligate yourself, it's within that understanding of that cable tow. Your cable tow is the outside restriction on how you are obligated internal to your brothers. And when you take your obligation, it's within the length of your cable tow, which basically means you are not only taking on the obligation of the craft, but you're also making sure that that obligation is within the length of your cable tow, which means that your civic, moral, and religious duties, be they what they may, are embraced as part of that obligation to the lodge.
I've been watching a lot of period piece, either movies or just shows on any of the streaming services or even in books. And it's interesting because if Freemasonry held a higher, I would say, regard in social prominence, and if not, then men who were Masons were at that time period in the 1700s tended to be at the higher end of the social chain, so to speak. You know, the more established man or gentleman was a Mason. The concept of keeping of murder, first of all, yes, as you're right, like across all times, horribly bad. One of the greats in the Bible, we know murder is horrible. But today we live in this time period where there's forensic evidence and science and, you know, DNA and, you know, police have more resources to solve crimes. Back then, if you were a person of in good standing, your word, you could point the finger and say this person did something, and that could be the difference between life and death over someone. Just as if you said, no, I would never think that person would ever did that, or that man was with me when this crime was committed.
No, our obligations are not binding us to lie for a brother.
Right.
Again, within our civil, moral, and religious duties, be they what they may, we are not being obligated to lie for a brother. And
right.
Any brother who puts the burden of that kind of secret upon us is basically putting us in a double bind, and, or shall I say, a perceived double bind. However, it's not a double bind when you understand that murder and treason are exceptions to keeping a secret.
And I would also point out that, as you mentioned, the lesson in the third degree that comes moments after that obligation, we've discussed in great detail here on the podcast before, comes in the Hiramic legend, where you have the true crime of the three ruffians is that they murder Hiram Abiff, and then they go about to cover up that crime and almost try to lie about it, but then they come clean about that, and we see what the penalty of that. Do you see any deeper connection between the ruffians, the murder charge, and the obligation in the Master Mason degree, or for once did I finally make a good connection here?
Oh, there's a direct correlation, because not only did they plot and scheme to murder him, but they actually pulled it off, and it was a treasonous act. They were disloyal to somebody very special, and they had an obligation to be loyal not only to him, but their brothers and to themselves. And so we're not talking about just murder here. We're talking about treason and murder. I mean, direct correlation between the obligation and what happened during the third degree.
Which treason is the other part of that phrase that we're going to examine. And looking through the vast history of Freemasonry, I think one of the best examples that even listeners we might have to the podcast that are not Freemasons would know, when I say the name Benedict Arnold, everyone knows who he is, and the treasonous act in 1780 that led to many things, his name being struck from Hiram Lodge number 1 and many other lodges that he visited in the Northeast. Of course, he was kicked out of the country and basically lived in exile for the remainder of his life. That example comes almost 60 years after where we would think the creation of the Master Mason degree was written. When we talk about treason today, how relevant do you find that as an obligation in our modern times?
Well, when you consider that this is a symbolic lodge and we're supposed to apply what goes on in the symbolic lodge symbolically, we start taking a look at the symbolism behind the words murder and treason, and we take it to an entirely different level. If you take it literally, well, you miss the whole lesson of what it is that you're supposed to be doing in the first and second degree, training your mind and training your heart to go beyond the literal and get into the symbolic. Literally, murder is the killing of another person without justification or excuse. Especially the crime of killing a person with malice aforethought or with recklessness, manifesting extreme indifference to the value of a human life. That's the literal translation. However, when you get into the symbolic aspect, well, you take several steps down the chain, you boil it down, it's an unlawful, premeditated killing of one human being by another. But what's really going on? Premeditation, unjustified action, and a willingness or indifference to do harm. So symbolically, we're talking about an act that's planned, illegal, and harmful. And it's just not a spontaneous harmful act, it's actually planned. So when you take a look at those things right there and apply it to what goes on in the third degree, bingo, direct correlation. They're plotting to extract information from another and willing to do so, even if it meant death/harm to their victim. So murder is a premeditated act where harm is involved.
Right. And the part with the treason that gets me is for almost 3 generations, those words existed in our ritual before Benedict Arnold, he was a brother, committed treason against the country. And I think it's one of those things where I hope men that go through the degree don't take that lightly, because they go, oh, I would never kill anybody else. I don't even go hunting or own a gun. I would never do that. Or I would never commit a crime and betray my country or countrymen in any way. But unfortunately, there was an example of that. And then I'm going to just look at your face, because I know you might make a violent movement as soon as I say the Morgan affair. I think is something else that also would relate to those words, and many Freemasons should be aware of that. As someone who was raised in and spent much time in upstate New York, I'm familiar with the Morgan affair and what the fallout of that murderous myth historical moment did to our craft for many generations.
The Morgan affair was a tragic historical event. And to this day, we do not have direct evidence that anything actually did happen. Although there are some graves up in that area with his name on it, nobody's made the connections and connected the dots, so to speak. I'm trying to look at that particular incident and correlate it back to murder and treason. What connections are you making?
Well, for me, I don't think, with everything that surrounded that, with Morgan saying that he was going to be publishing and then did publish, some of our ritual, that was a treasonous act to the fraternity of Freemasonry, not to the United States of America.
It was an act of portrayal.
Right. Does murder and treason, and I guess this is a great question to ask out loud, like, I'm immediately assuming treasonous acts to the country, but that could also apply to treasonous acts to the craft.
And there's where I was going with murder. When you boil down the essence into its figurative and symbolic application, we are not to keep the secrets of any person that reveals to us that what they are attempting to do is a premeditated act to do harm. It doesn't make a difference if it's murder or not. We're looking at it symbolically. If they're planning to do harm, then we're not obligated to keep their secret. It's that simple. And not only that, but if they're planning to do harm, what happens is there are now 2 victims, because now that they tell you that they plan on victimizing somebody or a society or a individual or organization, makes no difference. What they've done is they've now victimized you because you're now caught in a situation where you have foreknowledge of an illegal act, or not even illegal, immoral, unethical, makes no difference. Harm is going to be done. And it may even be harm to a reputation, makes no difference. It might be character assassination, where there is a victim, but there's no visible damage. But the person's now communicated to you that they're planning on backstabbing somebody, metaphorically. And what does that do for you? Well, I'm sorry. The moment that you tell me something that is going to cause harm, I'm now part of that. I'm part of the conspiracy. I'm with that spirit. And I am not obligated to keep that in my chest, because by keeping it in my chest, I will contribute to the harm of another human being or an organization or what have you. So when you look at murder symbolically, it's premeditated harm. It's that simple. And if I apply that to my obligation, because it is a symbolic lodge and a symbolic ritual, and I should be taking and training myself to see things symbolically, well, I connect the dots and immediately understand that if somebody conveys to me something where they are going to do something premeditated that will cause harm, or I go one step further, that they have caused harm and that they are now conveying to me the harm that they caused. Well, I'm sorry.
Or you learn of it.
Well, I learn of it. Am I obligated to keep that secret? Actually, no, because by keeping that secret, I will cause more harm by not allowing justice to be served. You know, you weigh it out. It's not a short putt.
Right. It is one of those things where I always sit here and go, all right, if you're opening up the ritual and you're following the word, the code, the obligation that we take and what we're supposed to be doing, right? So, okay, so what's the remedy for this? Well, you learn later in the third degree, you can whisper wise counsel into a brother's ear who's erring or has made an error as to what to do. You go through that step and that doesn't resolve the situation. It's like, okay, well, it doesn't say then at this point, then I go tell local authorities or I do, but then what's the charge in the first degree say? We must act as a good citizen and follow and obey all the laws. So then you fall back into that. And of course, it's not all spelled out for you, but the tools and the resources you need to help make those clear decisions are provided. You just have to do the work.
And when I say it's not a short putt, it takes a lot of soul searching to come to the conclusions that I've come to. And you just don't come to this overnight. You have to train your mind and your heart to recognize when these things are occurring. And I believe that's part and parcel of what it is that the first and second degree asks us to do. Think through these situations so that when a third degree obligation is plopped down in front of you and you're asked to basically commit to not keeping secrets of somebody who's going to cause harm, and also the treasonous aspect, which we need to get involved in, you really do not have to think it through. It becomes a short putt because you've done the work to come to the conclusions that you know exactly what it is that you need to do in situations like this. So when it comes to murder, the symbolic aspect is you're not required to keep secrets and that are involving premeditation or anticipated harm.
Yeah.
You know,
And that's in the relief for our listeners should know, as someone who's been a Freemason for almost 10 years now, I have never come across a brother that has told or has expressed or I've known of that has ever committed murder or treason. So thankfully have never been put into that situation. But I would also say this when I do get the question, does that mean that Freemasons wouldn't testify against each other in court if they did something wrong? I'm like, heck no. If I had a brother that committed a crime and I was aware of it or had information to share, I would testify against
You
them
are
because that's my job to do. Yeah.
you are obligated to testify because the brother has fallen short. And as a result of falling short, you are required to bring him to justice, just as the fellow craft did in the case of the three fellow craft who followed through on the murder and the treasonous act of killing Hiram Abiff. The other fellow craft basically were told if you did not bring these three to justice, you would suffer the same fate that they would had they been brought to justice. So they were highly motivated to find these three. But it is one of these things that it tells me that should I ever hear of situations very similar to this symbolically, where people are plotting treason and or murder, or shall I say, they are plotting to be disloyal and they are plotting harm. Well, I not only am obligated to not keep that secret, but I'm also obligated to bring these individuals to justice. I'm now involved with foreknowledge that this is going to occur. So I'm on the hook. I got to do the right thing.
You've also expressed this because if you are a fan of having conversations on ethics and morals and values, and are not a Freemason, I think you would enjoy that aspect of a lot of what our ritual is, especially the deeper meanings in some of the teachings. But in your blog post, and we're going to share this in the show links in this podcast episode, a brother asks, why only murder and treason? You talk about another level. So let's go there. How does our conversation on murder and treason apply to someone's morals?
In order to get to that next level, you need to lay the foundation for the treason aspect. Quite literally, treason is the betrayal of allegiance toward one's own country, especially by committing hostile acts against it or aiding its enemies in committing such acts. However, it's also the betrayal of someone's trust or confidence. And right then and there, we take a look at what happened in the third degree, and there was a tremendous amount of betrayal toward Hiram Abiff. And so if we tunnel down that rabbit hole and we just keep on looking further, committing the crime of murder, particularly if you have owed allegiance to them, that's treason. And that's exactly what happened in the third degree. And it's therefore treason is actually linked to murder in certain situations. But when you commit a treasonous act, you are betraying, you're disloyal. And what you're effectively doing is you're murdering the relationship. So when you apply the symbolic aspect of what Blue Lodge offers you, literally, it opens to a mind-expanding opportunity for you to look at all aspects of your life and say, okay, now that I've got the symbolic understanding, how is this perhaps playing out in my life? How many times have I done harm? How many times have I betrayed and been disloyal?
Right. And I think if there's any questions that linger, like how should I act? How should I be? I always go back to the first degree where you're told act and, as an upright man and Mason in all of your actions before. I'm paraphrasing, of course, but our ritual says this is basically how you're supposed to conduct yourself now. You're a man and you're a Freemason, and go act this way to everyone that you come in contact with. And when you keep that in your mind, and then yes, there's the Hiramic legend, which of course, but all of the resources that come from the lessons and the working tools, all of the charges it's pretty well laid out to you, like what the example of how you should be living your life as a man and Mason is.
And you're keeping secrets in your obligations. They have safeguards. Your obligations will not interfere with your duty that you owe to your God, yourself, family, country, or neighbor.
Right.
And if it does, you know that it has nothing to do with your obligations. It has to do with something external, because your obligations will not interfere with that. And then again, you've got what I had said before about the cable tow. within the limits of your cable toe, which mean that nothing is inconsistent with one's civil, moral, or religious duties, be they what they may. So once again, if you think you're being loyal because of some misunderstanding of the obligation, when somebody shares a secret with you that reveals that they are going to do harm or they're going to be disloyal to the point where harm is going to be an element of that, well, you have a duty to yourself not to put yourself in harm's way. And this is where taking it to the next level, when you understand that if you keep a secret and you murder your own values and you murder your own morals, or you're not loyal, if you're betrayed your own sensibilities toward your values and your morals and your ethics, that's taking it to a whole different level. And when you realize that murder and treason excluded, I'm going to purposely say excluded because of how accepted and accepted are so closely sounding.
Yeah.
So when I understand that I am not obligated in any way, shape, or form to keep a secret, and then flip that around and say, well, actually, I'm obligated to convey that secret to the right authorities when betrayal, disloyalty, harm is going to occur, then we're in the bind that the fellow crafts had when they were told, if you don't get these dudes, you're going to suffer it if they don't.
See, is difficult or challenging, maybe uncomfortable at times as this conversation may have been for us, because we're like, we can't really think of any bad examples because we're both good guys and most of the other brothers we know are good guys. It's so much easier to have this conversation with brothers than when I have conversations on deep matters with my friends that are just out there in the real world. And I'm like, man, it would be so much easier for us to talk about this if you were like-minded and a fellow brother. It would be a lot better.
It definitely helps tremendously. So when you said taking it to the next level, when you're applying it to yourself and recognizing that the exception to keeping a secret are acts that are acts of betrayal where harm is involved or harm is generally involved, you're not obligated to keep those secrets, but you are really obligated to make sure that the information gets into the right hands to prevent that harm and that betrayal from occurring. And if I had brothers that were conveying to me that they're going to betray the trust, the first thing I'm going to do is say, I want you to understand what you're telling me. Telling me that you are going to betray the trust somebody has placed in you, and it is going to cause that person harm. I just want to make sure I'm really clear on what it is that you're planning on doing, and that you're conveying this to me as a secret that you're asking me to keep in my chest, when I fully realize that two elements are very outstanding. You're betraying this person and you're causing them harm. Is that what you're trying to have me keep in my chest? I just want to make sure I'm clear on this.
Right. And also, like, it's kind of back to the same point, but it's that it's easier, I feel, for us to have this conversation with Brother Masons. But I feel like this part of the obligation, while it does specifically address if a fellow brother comes up and shares a secret with you, this is how you're supposed to act. It also is preparing you for, as you're laying out, how to interact with these situations in the real world, because they come in many different angles. And that's the stuff that makes hair fall out or turn white at gray in a certain age. And looking at the both of us on camera, we've been placed in these difficult situations. And with those experience comes, that sagey wisdom that people come up to us and try to glean by asking questions. But this is the thing, is that I think that particular line, well, it may not seem relevant to the brother at that moment, and maybe hopefully will never be relevant to them during their time as a Freemason with dealing with other brothers in the craft. It sure as heck is going to be a great tool to have in dealing with interactions that will come outside of the fraternity, where you really display the morality and the values of being a Freemason.
And I hope and pray that no brother has to deal with these situations. However, should they have to deal with them, it's not like they have not been handed the keys to the city when it comes to how they need to respond. It's pretty
Right.
straightforward. And again, it becomes a short putt once you've thought through the dynamics and all the elements that are involved in the symbolic application of what it is that can be taken literally. And as a result, they miss the entire point. And that's the saddest aspect of some brothers' experience of ritual. They take it literally, and therefore they're really looking for those literal interpretations to be applied in their life. And, they're looking for a Benedict Arnold, or they're looking for a Manson character. And they don't realize is that sometimes brothers get involved in situations where they voice what they plan on doing, and they don't even realize the depth of what they're communicating heart to heart with a brother that they believe they should trust. If they believe they can trust, the brother's going to turn around and say, hey, let me spell out what I hear you saying to me, so that it's very clear between the two of us what it is you plan on doing.
He's always on point with that wise counsel. Our guest, Brother John Nagy, thanks so much for coming back on this episode of the Craftsman Online podcast.
Thanks again for having me, Brother Michael. Do you have a preview of what it is that's coming up next?
Well, I wanted to talk with you about that because I
Yeah.
have a couple things, but it'll be good.
No doubt.
I can tell you this: if you've enjoyed this episode and you want to hear more, you can tell Siri or Alexa to play the Craftsman Online podcast. We are available on all streaming platforms with new episodes every Monday morning. Until next time, let peace and harmony prevail.
You've been listening to a Brother Asks and Building Better Builders video education series production.